A while back, I made a video that was all about answering a question posed on the Pottery Subreddit about how to throw a particular shape. The form in question was a wide dish, like so. And in this week's video, I'll be covering not only the throwing and the trimming, but also the waxing, glazing, and how the pots are finally reduction fired. As you might guess, I spend a lot of time online, and in my lurking I found this post by user fullad6048. And the vessel in question was a wide bowl with a narrow foot and very overhanging walls. Somebody suggested that they should try watching my videos for help, and so here we are. I thought this would make an interesting topic for a video, as it's always quite interesting dissecting a shape and figuring out the best way to make it. So I'll quickly take their picture into Photoshop to show you my thoughts on this pot. The first thing I noticed is that the measurements here don't really add up. Rather, what I mean is visually the pot should be wider than it is tall in this image. It's a touch too tall here if we go by these measurements, and once converted into centimetres, and with 12% added to account for shrinkage, I'll have to make a shape that's 24 centimetres wide and 7.5 centimetres tall. The other thing I noticed is that the foot on this is perhaps a bit too narrow, and if the walls were trimmed to be very fine and even throughout, there's a good chance the overhanging walls would simply slump, both during the throwing stage and when fired. So in order for the piece to survive the throwing stage, I'm going to have to make it with some support clay underneath. This way the shape can be thrown without the walls collapsing. Of course there doesn't have to be this much material, but essentially you need enough just to support the shape, after which at the leather hard stage much of this can be trimmed away. So you can sort of think about this additional clay a bit like scaffolding. It's there, but only temporarily, to help the object keep its shape as the soft clay dries. So, I think the shape will actually end up looking a bit more like this, although the foot itself is just still too narrow, so instead I'm going to widen the foot. This way the walls don't overhang so much, and the thicker, sturdier foot will help the pot keep its shape as it's fired. I'm also going to throw these pots on bats, as shapes like this that are wider than they are tall can be practically impossible to lift off the wheel with only your hands, because as you lift, the wide shape made from soft clay will just bow inwards, distorting. So, to get started, and so that I can attach bats to my wheel, I begin by throwing a pad of clay which I dry out to leather hard, and then on top of this I'll be able to attach MDF bats, essentially creating a platform which I can then throw on and lift away. This way I don't actually have to lift up the pot itself, but instead the bat it's been made upon. This is typically how you throw flatware. Now, at this stage I'm not entirely sure how much clay I should be using, but I'll start with 2.5 pounds, which is 1,133 grams, although I think I'm going to have to end up using more to account for the tall foot this piece has. To attach these bats I dampen one side of them. I don't wet them too much, otherwise they will just glide off, but if dampened properly it makes them sticky. Then I place it onto the pad of clay, tap center it, and then most crucially I shake it back and forth while pressing down. This really sticks it in place. I then also dampen a patch on the top, as it really helps the lump of clay stick. Now, for a bowl shape like this, my aim is to centre this piece into a low, flat disc, although at this stage I could already feel like there wasn't quite enough clay for the shape I want, as not only do I need a certain amount of thickness in the bottom, so that there's material to trim the foot from, but I also need to leave that scaffolding, as it's this that helps to hold the pot up at this stage. This is the sort of shape I want, and the wider you make this initial disc, the more support you'll have in the walls. So in the next few iterations I'll probably begin with a wider disc. But for the time being, I can now simply begin to throw this like I would any other pot. I begin by opening up the lump to create a hollow in the centre. I can then pinch and thin out the outer wall as I lift, widening the shape until the rim is about 24 centimetres across. I think with practice you could throw this shape with this amount of clay, although I haven't left much material in the bottom, so you may struggle to turn as prominent a foot as you'd like. The next step is to begin straightening the walls on this top section. This can be relatively tricky to do without imparting some sort of undulation into the rim, especially on a piece this wide. But truth be told, I don't mind if there is a tiny amount of movement, as I can very easily deal with it at the leather hard stage. It's not quite wide enough yet, and this is where we begin to encounter the issues that arise if there's not enough clay in the bottom, especially if you are working with softer material, which typically I recommend for flatware, as it makes centering it and pressing it into a wide flat disc much easier. But the obvious issue is that this means the clay isn't as strong, and is therefore more susceptible to losing its shape, distorting or collapsing. And that's precisely what's going to happen with this piece, as unless I completely blasted the entire thing with a heat gun to really dry out the clay, there's no way I can tidy up the surfaces of this pot without it collapsing. And I think if I try to throw that sharp angle I want, where the upper portion meets the overhanging section, the clay won't have enough strength to hold its shape. And there comes a point where you're fighting a losing battle, and you're probably better off simply letting the pot collapse and starting again. So I've added a pound of extra weight. That's 3.5 pounds in total, or some 1,587 grams. This feels much better, as I was able to make a wider disc initially, which means I'll have more supportive clay underneath and in the base. These pots will require rather a lot of trimming, but there are some forms that are simply less of a hassle to throw with more clay, and then you spend time at the leather hard stage trimming that excess away. What this can do is allow you to throw the forms much more quickly, instead of say spending 2 to 3 minutes extra slowly finessing the shape. I tend to be of the mindset, especially if it's a pot I have to make many hundreds of, that I throw them in the quickest way possible, and then do much of the refinement at the leather hard stage. Not with all shapes, of course. Say with mugs, for instance, I tend to throw those pretty much to their final shape, as they aren't much of a challenge, but a shape like this is altogether a different story. I think this piece is almost there. I need to straighten the exterior wall a touch, but it's the right height and width now, which means I can now set my throwing gauge's pointer. This way, when I throw more bowls afterwards, I don't have to individually measure each piece with a ruler. As for the pointer itself, I set it so it's level with the rim, but with perhaps about a millimetre of space in between them. This way they aren't constantly colliding, the pointer leaving scratches in the clay. I can now begin refining the exterior shape, which I'm doing with a sharp brass kidney to scrape away the slip that covers the surface. To do this, I typically press the clay from the inside out against the metal edge, as this imparts less stress on the pot, and typically it'll hold its shape better. I can now switch my focus to tidying up the inside. I want to try and keep a really lovely curve here, whilst not digging away too much material from the bottom, as the more depth I create at this stage, the shorter the pot's foot rim will be. I then chamois the rim smooth to create a more aesthetically pleasing beveled edge that's consistent all the way around. And lastly, I can scrape away some of that excess material from the base of the pot. Scraping away as much slip and wet clay from the pot as I can at this stage will help the vessel dry out to leather hard more quickly, which is typically something potters want, as if pots are left covered in slip, not only does it increase the drying time quite dramatically, but in some cases, if it is a slightly more complicated shape, the pot itself can deform and collapse as the clay deteriorates as it's kept wet for so long. You might have noticed that I haven't wired this off yet. Instead, that's something I'll do a bit later, after the pot has dried out a touch. There is a bit of a knack to attaching the bats, as if I'm being honest it is quite tricky, but this shaking back and forth helps tremendously, as long as the bat hasn't been wetted too much. The bats themselves have been in storage and are quite dry and dusty, and if I didn't wet it like this, the lump of clay would sort of just come off, like dough placed on a floured surface. For this next piece, I'm using 4.5 pounds, or just over 2 kilos. I think this might actually be too much clay, but it means I'll be able to leave plenty of material in the base. This way I can trim the bowl to have an elegant, tall foot. This was definitely the easiest to throw, although due to all the excess clay in the bottom, it'll also require the most trimming. Just a quick note about skimming clay away from the bottom like this. Try not to let too much gather on the tool itself, as otherwise this material can press up into the form above, distorting the walls of the pot. So it's best, if you can, to scrape it back bit by bit. Also, I throw this clay directly into the reclaim bucket to my left, instead of letting it slop into the wheel tray. This just helps to keep things tidier for longer. I also scrape clean the bat itself, as the less slip there is covering it, the less mess is spread across the studio, and it also helps to keep the bats dry, relatively, which should mean they don't warp quite so much. And with that, I'll throw one last dish, which is thrown from 4.5 pounds. The only thing I was slightly unhappy with on a few of these are the strong throwing rings left on the interior wall on the top section. And if I throw these again, I think I'll try to make this more of a seamless curve with a straighter surface, as I may need to trim these a touch from the inside to get rid of them. I don't mind subtle throwing rings on some shapes, but with these I was able to scrape the lower half of the bowl smooth, whilst that top section of the wall had them, and I'm not particularly keen on that contrast. I'll let these bowls dry out for the rest of the day, and once they've firmed up, I'll drag a wire underneath them, as this should mean their shape is distorted less. To wire them off, I brace the bat against my knee, and then I simply drag a wire underneath it. I then place a bat over the top and flip them over. This way, overnight, I can leave the pot with its base exposed, which will help this thicker, wetter section dry out. It's now 2 days later, and the bottoms of these are finally dry enough to trim. Considering how thick the bottoms are on 2 of these, it took a rather long time for enough moisture to leave them, so that they were in a state they could be trimmed. On the whole, I think this should be relatively easy going, as wide pots like this hold themselves onto the wheel rather well. I'm beginning with the piece with the very tall foot. I trim over the throwing rings on the inside, and then I can begin refining the rest of the pot. Unfortunately, as this piece dried, the subtle undulation the piece had developed into one that was a bit more severe. It should be manageable, and it's the sort of thing that you stop noticing as soon as the wheel stops spinning. So provided the rest of the pot is trimmed to a relatively high degree, then I tend not to mind if there is movement in the pot. And in my opinion, there are far worse things you can do in terms of finish, compared to leaving small amounts of movement like this piece will have. With the bowl now flipped over and securely held in place, I can begin work, refining the underside and trimming the foot. This circle shows the initial proposed width of the foot in the original drawing, but I have to make it wider, simply for the pot to hold its shape as it's fired. I feel like something this wide should do it. Throughout much of this process, I'm going to trim with a spinner placed on top, as I can push down firmly through this to pin the dish in place. This is particularly useful for this initial bit of trimming, as I tend to carve away clay quite aggressively, and without any sort of downward pressure as I did this, there's a very high chance that the bowl will begin jittering in place, or it would even leap up out of its restraints where the pieces of clay are holding it around the rim. If you take a freeze frame here, I actually really adore this shape without the need of a foot ring, but I can't change it at this stage as the pot would be far too heavy due to all the excess clay left in the lower half of the walls, but perhaps we can revisit this more angular shape in the future. As for this piece, to begin the foot, I simply trim downward exactly where I want the foot to be, and then I can begin to turn away the excess in between where the foot is and where the ledge is further down. The next step is removing the excess clay from inside the foot, and the general rule when you do this is that you should trim down deep enough to match the height of the wall on the outside portion of the foot ring. Think of it like this: if you trimmed the base of this pot without a foot, you'd want it to have a mostly seamless curve. Yet if there is a foot, it should look as if it's just been stuck onto the bottom of this seamless curve. So in theory there are two things I'm thinking about: the shape of the foot ring itself, and beneath that the continuous, uninterrupted shape of the bowl. In terms of wheel speed, I always go relatively quickly when trimming. It helps me create more consistent surfaces, as compared to if you trim very slowly and therefore cautiously. It's almost easier to maintain consistent pressure with the wheel spinning at a certain speed. Now, the reason I'm trimming on the outside again was due to the fact that I was able to trim deeper on the interior shape than I thought. Therefore, I have to trim the outside to match it, if I want to keep that seamless shape. The foot ring itself is beveled slightly on either side. This way it doesn't have crisp, sharp edges that would be very susceptible to chipping. I then scrape flat the inside of the foot ring just to create a slightly neater surface. And then, lastly, I can stamp the foot with my maker's mark. This can sometimes cause the clay around the mark to splay outward, so I do compress over it if I notice that. I'll also take a measurement of the foot. This way I can trim the others to match. It can then be carefully taken off and set aside on a bat. And I'm just going to run a dense, damp sponge over it, which I've soaked. This creates a smoother surface, provided you don't overwork the clay. And that's the first of 3 bowls I'm making finished. The second bowl has much more clay in the foot. but again, like the one previously, I'm going to begin by centering it upright and just smoothing that interior edge where those throwing rings are. I'm also going to refine the interior shape a touch, smoothing the clay and scraping it back where necessary. Whenever I flip pots over, I make sure to clean the wheel head before the rim is set down on the metal, as I've just spent some time carefully trimming and refining the lip of the bowl. If I were to just place it atop a messy wheel head, it could easily be damaged, marked, or imprinted by the debris that's commonly left over on the wheel. I definitely could have used less clay, yet it does come with the added satisfaction of doing all this trimming. After all, this is the process I enjoy most. As I trim here, I'm holding the blade both from the tip and firmly by the handle. In fact, whenever I turn pots, I'm holding the tool with extreme care. It's not held loosely with one hand by just the end of the handle. Instead, I really grip it securely, and very often I use my other hand to brace the tool to add even more stability. As I trim, I press down gently, looking for any movement, and as soon as I feel that the floor of the pot bends in just ever so slightly, that's when I stop trimming. The foot itself, despite being the part of the pot that often goes forgotten and unseen, is probably the part of the piece that I finish to the highest degree, as it's the only part that isn't going to be covered in glaze. That's the piece with the tool foot trimmed. I think it'll have a greater effect once turned over, and I'm very careful about how I lift the pot, as I don't want to apply too much pressure to the foot, as that could distort it. And when I can, I flip the pots in between two bats, like so. This is the safest way to flip pots like this. Plates too, especially, as there's no way the shape can be bent as it's flipped. There is a wavering motion in this pot, but like I mentioned earlier, it's not severe enough to be a problem, and as soon as the wheel stops spinning, you don't notice it anymore. I quite like how raised it is though, and compared to the bowl I trimmed first, proportionally it feels a bit more intentional. It's more elegant too, but I think ultimately I could have got away throwing the shape with less clay, regardless. If you're the person who made that original post, I hope you found this breakdown helpful. Like I mentioned the first time I made this video, I genuinely really enjoyed the challenge of creating a pot that somebody else was struggling with, or simply needed some guidance on how to make. Anyhow, for now, I'm going to cover these with plastic so they can dry slowly. This should help them keep their shape. And then about a week or so later, after the pots are turned bone dry, they can be packed into my electric kiln for a biscuit firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. This chemically changes clay into ceramic, the stoneware's particles beginning to fuse, which makes it absorbent. The vessel's now able to take in water without dissolving into slurry. The clay also shrinks slightly at this stage and becomes much stronger, but it's also quite fragile and water will pass through it if, for instance, you fill a mug or a bowl up with it. It's only during the second firing to a much hotter temperature that the stoneware will become fully vitrified, meaning that liquid can no longer pass through it. Before the bowls can be dipped in glaze though, the first thing I have to do is coat the foot ring with wax. This will act like a resist, preventing the glaze from adhering to the foot, which in the long run should mean that I spend less time tidying the pot up after it's been glazed. I do this as if the foot was covered in glaze, and then I set it upright on its foot in the kiln for the glaze firing. The piece would simply fuse to the kiln shelf, and once cool, I'd simply have to rip the bowl away, which would most likely completely destroy it. There are ways of getting around this. For instance, you can glaze the piece entirely and then set the bowl up on waddings. This is a clay-like substance which you can then grind away after the firing, but with a glaze as thick as the one I'm going to be using, this is a real gamble. It would also mean you have to spend hours tidying up the pots after the firing, a process where if you slip or make a mistake, you could permanently scratch good glaze elsewhere on the pot. The bowl is then held with a pair of tongs and dipped into glaze. With hindsight, I should have done this more carefully, but the thing is when you're dipping a new shape, you sort of have to learn how best to submerge it and then remove it in order to find the best possible way for the glaze to settle in the neatest layer. I think I should have removed them from the glaze much more slowly. This way the glaze comes off without leaving such dramatic drips on the surface as it dries. Glazes themselves can be mixed up from dozens and dozens of different materials. This one contains some talc, some nepheline cyanide, some china clay, some whiting, some synthetic bone ash, some frit, and the colour comes from 2% red iron oxide. And it's this that creates the green tone once fired, but only in a reduction atmosphere. In an oxidised firing, this same glaze turns yellow, but also the colour of the clay underneath makes a huge difference in the final colour and appearance of the glaze itself. As the pot is dipped, the water all these materials are mixed up into is absorbed into the body, and this leaves a layer of the raw materials like I just mentioned on the outside surface of the pot, as their particles are too large to be absorbed. And it's at this stage, now a few days later, after the glaze is fully dried out, that I can tidy up its surface where any stray drips or tongue marks are. The foot ring itself is given the most attention. Yet, as my glazing of these was rather messy, there are some lumps and bumps that cover the surface which I have to deal with, as any sort of major inconsistency in the glaze's surface will show in the finished product. At the same time, if I grind away any part of the glaze to be too thin, this can also create a slightly discoloured patch. So if anything, an area where the glaze is thicker is better than a thin patch. I typically use flat metal scrapers to do this, which I can glide across the surface. This way, I know I'm not accidentally removing too much. By the way, before I started doing this, I cleaned the tabletop and let it dry. This way I can collect all the glaze dust at the end and place it into that basin of water you can see in the background. And eventually I can sieve this back into the larger bucket of glaze the pot was initially dipped into. Those beveled edges I trimmed on either side of the foot actually come in really handy when tidying up, so I can sort of just use them like a guide to glide the knife along. Despite waxing this surface, there is still always some glaze that clings onto it. This tends to be more so the case when you're applying very thick glazes. The last thing I do is just wipe over this area with a damp sponge to create a surface that's pristine, like this. By the way, the wax that's coated onto these just burns away during the firing, so there's no need to get rid of it yourself. Out of all the processes, this is perhaps the most monotonous and mundane, but it's also quite rare that I glaze pots this poorly. You can clearly see the raised drips on this piece, and I try to scrape most of these back to being flush, first with the sharp metal scraper and then my fingertip. There was also a thumbprint on this piece from where I tried to pick up the bowl when it was still too soft. So to try and fix this, I dabbed some extra glaze onto it, which I could then scrape back to being flush, and then use my thumb to sort of sand over it, the excess dust that comes off filling the tiny holes that are left. Glazing, on the whole, is a tricky process, as when throwing in trimming pots, or say carving wood, or painting, the results are immediately there in front of you, whereas with glazing, you won't actually see the finished results until they've been through the kiln, and if something does mess up during that process, there's actually very little you can do to rectify it, and generally, it's too late anyway. What I mean by this is often, at the glazing stage, you don't spot your mistakes until it's too late. And it comes with a huge amount of trial and error, and occasionally, sometimes simply bizarre things happen during the firing that you can't really account for, but I suppose that's part of what makes ceramics interesting, as sometimes you can open the kiln to glorious surprises, and other times there might be nothing but disappointment, so to some degree it's a bit of a gamble. But I find it really interesting, as due to all this trial and error, potters can become so exacting with a particular set of glazes they use. Then you may suddenly switch to another sort, and suddenly it's a whole new world. You may have noticed that raised lump this piece had on one side, and to get rid of it I've been using this razor-sharp knife to very gradually slice it back until it's flush. Whenever you're carving away glaze like this, it should be a process you do gradually. Don't try and take off too much glaze in one go, as most likely it'll chip off and bring much more glaze with it than you anticipated. Slow and steady is certainly the way when it comes to tidying up pots. When I'm rubbing the pot with my fingertip, I'm constantly checking to feel how flat the surface feels. If I feel like there's a bump, I'll scrape it back until it's flush. And if I feel like there's a hole in the glaze, I'll use the excess dust that covers the surface to fill it up, and then I can fettle it smooth. This process of glazing is something that I've got much faster at over the last couple of years, although I think part of that has something to do with what I mentioned earlier, which has been gradually learning how to glaze different shapes in the best possible way. I think if I had a machine that would do this step for me, I'd do it. Yet, as a beginner, knowing how to glaze pots and tidy them up afterwards is one of those crucial skills you sort of need to know as a potter. But after going through this exact procedure on tens of thousands of pots, I'd be very happy to give this task over to an assistant or an apprentice. It's not necessarily creative, the application process at least, but it requires a tremendous amount of care and attention and dexterous hands. With all of these pots glazed and tidied up, they can be packed into my Roda KG340 gas kiln. This kiln, unlike the other, is fueled with mains gas, and in doing so it allows me to fire the kiln in a state called reduction. This is where I purposefully starve the kiln of oxygen to create an atmosphere where the fuel is burning inefficiently. Essentially, too much gas accumulates within the chamber, and in its search for oxygen to burn properly, it ends up stripping it away from the clay and glazes themselves. And in this case, that means chemically changing the iron oxide these glazes have in them, apart from the white, of course. This reduction atmosphere also causes iron that's present in the clay itself to flux and melt into tiny metallic orbs that cover the surface of the glaze and the clay. In a way, one thing a gas kiln does is make creating surface interest easier, as it sort of just happens naturally throughout the process itself. Whereas if you're firing with an electric kiln, you sort of have to work a bit harder to achieve this interest, which is why, in one way, I've got so much respect for people who create fantastic surfaces with an electric kiln. This gas kiln is fired entirely by hand. You can purchase ones that fire automatically, but they're complex machines that cost upwards of £100,000, but maybe one day in my dream studio. I start the reduction atmosphere at 860 degrees Celsius precisely, and thereafter I keep the temperature rising up gradually until the pyrometric cones inside have fully bent over at about 1290 degrees Celsius. It's now about 2 days later, and the kiln has cooled down enough to be unpacked. It's still really hot inside, but generally the pots at the bottom can be unpacked straight away, whereas those on top are scalding hot. The pots shrink again in this firing, and in fact from freshly thrown to finally fired like they are here, they shrink about 12%. This might sound trivial, but it's something you really have to take into account when you're actually throwing the pots themselves, as it's fairly common for beginners to throw pots they think will remain that size once fired, only then to be shocked by how small they are once they're out of the kiln. Anyhow, here's the first two, a dark green crackle glaze bowl and the white version. And lastly, the pale green bowl, which I thought fired wonderfully until I noticed this thin patch of glaze inside. This is such a shame, but I think I'll try reglazing it and firing it again in the future. The feet of these need some tidying up, and that's the next step, as sometimes battwash, which is the white stuff you saw covering the kiln shelves, sticks to the feet, but it comes off easily. I typically use Diamond Core Tools diamond pads to do this, which I soak in water and then lightly polish the stoneware with so that it doesn't scratch whichever surface it's placed on. At the same time, I don't want to grind away too much, as the flashed orange-brown colour you see on the surface is only really surface level, and if ground away too much, I'll just reveal a dark grey colour inside, which could be nice if it covered the entire foot, say, but if you just grind away one specific patch to reveal this colour, it can make the colour on the foot look a bit uneven and not particularly nice. That's just this particular clay body though. For instance, porcelain doesn't flash in quite the same way, and if I was making pots from that, I would grind the feet more thoroughly, as it'll be white both inside and out. It's now weeks after these were initially thrown, to give you a better understanding of the timescales involved in making pottery. I don't mind these pieces, but I think if I had to make bowls like this more consistently, I'd be making the shape I showed you a freeze frame of earlier in this video. Thankfully, none of the walls of these pots slumped, which makes me think I could have perhaps made the foot ring slightly narrower, and to give it a greater chance of survival, I could have left the overhanging wall slightly thicker, but to be honest with you, I am a bit surprised. I really thought there would be some movement in these post-firing. My biggest regret is the inconsistent glazing, as none of these are perfect. Especially the pale green piece with a thin patch inside. This is precisely what happens if I rub the glaze back too much, but I might try heating the pot up and then pouring glaze on the inside, swirling it around and tipping it out, to essentially apply another layer of glaze on the inside before firing it a second time. The other option is brushing a metallic glaze on the inside and firing it again. It'll certainly be easier, but it'll change the nature of the bowl quite dramatically. And lastly, here's the white piece, or the grey piece, really. And I think once glazed, this might actually be my favourite. Anyhow, thank you so much for watching this beginning to end video. If there's ever a shape you're struggling with or would like to see me have a go at, don't hesitate to send me a message or leave it in the comments of this video. I learnt a lot making these, and annoyingly it's made me want to tackle them again so that I can get the glazing right. Great pasta bowls though, I think, and as the glazes on none of these are perfect, they might be pots that come home with me, which is actually relatively rare. Despite being a potter, most of the pots I use at home aren't mine, but are those made by my friends and potters I aspire to. Thank you so much for taking your precious time to watch, especially if you've made it all the way to the end. And, as always, I'll see you next time.